I understand that OCP allows leaders to pinpoint the difference between perhaps what they think is happening and what the ideal would be. Can it give them any other information?
Well, yeah, there are actually two ways that leaders benefit from using the OCP. One is by learning about the substantive basis for their organization's culture. Are we way too detail-oriented and not focused on innovation enough? Are we so collaborative that we're actually slowing down a little bit? So that's a great comparison. But the second insight that it offers is that we measure the strength of the culture directly. And we measure that by the extent to which people in the organization agree about what the current culture looks like and agree about what the desired culture should look like. And that's an important consideration for leaders, because if they're starting from a point where people disagree vehemently about what the current culture is and or about what the desired culture is, then that means you need to build the case for why the desired culture in particular is so important to emphasize certain characteristics. That typically means that the leader has not had done a thorough enough job in emphasizing the strategic priorities for the organization. So that's an important place to start, even before you start thinking about, what are the gaps in the culture. Right. And my research has really been focused on the combination of the substantive aspects of culture and the strength of an organization's culture. Most research has sort of clumped those things together and assumed strength when they're actually talking about substance. And in fact, it's really an important question to tease apart the extent to which the culture is strong versus not strong. Because if the culture is not strong, the substantive aspects are probably not that solid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing, again, from a layman's standpoint, a lot of times we think of culture as just more of a squishy kind of thing, an emotional sort of thing, but what you're saying seems to be that it's the data that's telling the story. Would that be your advice to leaders, to look at the data?
One of the hardest things about culture is that it is so soft. Mm-hmm. And what I've tried to devote my career to is offering an analytical framework for thinking about culture. What we know is that no matter what leaders do or don't do, a culture will form. Culture is inevitable in organizations. Anytime you get people meeting together on a regular basis where important things are at stake, like their job and their reputation and their pay, norms will form. So really, leaders don't have a choice about whether a culture will form or it won't form. Mm-hmm. What they do have a choice about is whether that culture is one that will enable them to achieve their strategic objectives. Or worst case scenario, an unmanaged culture which constrains them from being able to do so. Mm-hmm. So my view is that culture is way too important to leave to chance. And even though it is soft and difficult to capture, I think with an analytical framework and an objective way of quantitatively assessing culture, mm-hmm. leaders are in a much better position to be able to deliberately create and inspire a culture that will help them achieve their strategic objectives.
And thinking about those objectives as key, then are you saying don't leave it to chance, don't let it be bottom up, it's more top down?
No, because part of culture change involves in bringing people into the organization to help you execute or figure out what that culture is going to look like in behavioral terms. It varies across organizations, but typically what I recommend is that leaders conduct an assessment of their organization's culture, and because they and their leadership team have the best understanding of their strategy, that they weigh in reasonably heavily on what the aspirational culture is going to emphasize, which doesn't mean that they discount any of the data they've looked at. It may mean that they select the high priority mm-hmm. gaps mm-hmm. among a couple of gaps. Mm-hmm. But then the culture change process is simultaneously top down and bottom up. Mm-hmm. And if you don't invite people in to help with that change, it's never going to happen. You're not going to get the buy-in, exactly. Right. I think transparency around culture is very, very important. And a leader's best friend in this situation is to be clear about strategic priorities. In fact, if you're clear about strategic priorities and you ask people, well, what behaviors would solve for these strategic priorities, you can pretty much count on people coming up with a fairly tight set of behavioral priorities that are going to suit that set of strategic initiatives.